The luxury train sliced through the snowy Alps, its first-class compartment a world of quiet refinement. Inside, passengers reclined in velvet seats, sipping champagne and savouring the tranquility of the journey. But tranquility as fleeting as the winter landscape beyond the windows was about to be shattered. "Excuse me, ma'am. This section is first class. May I see your ticket?" Carl Becker said, his tone clipped and pointed. "Doctor?" Juanita Sinclair looked up from her seat by the window. The glow of the passing scenery reflected on her calm, composed face, a face that, unbeknownst to many, belonged to one of the most celebrated neurosurgeons in the world. She retrieved her ticket without hesitation, handing it to Carl with a polite smile. He studied it, his lips tightening, before tossing it back with little regard. "Must be nice to get an upgrade," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. The peace of the journey dissolved in that moment. It wasn't the words themselves, but the weight behind them, an unspoken judgment, a question of her belonging in a space she'd rightfully claimed. The train continued forward, but the harmony inside had been broken. And for Juanita, the challenge was just beginning. Dr. Juanita Sinclair was no stranger to first-class travel, though she often wished she could avoid it altogether. Globally celebrated for her work as a neurosurgeon, she had spent years earning her place among the most respected names in medicine. Her accolades were numerous: humanitarian awards, honorary degrees, and global recognition for her relentless efforts to bring advanced medical care to underserved communities. Yet, for all her accomplishments, Juanita remained grounded. She saw herself not as a celebrity, but as a servant to humanity, devoted to saving lives and championing equity in healthcare. This journey to Geneva was no exception. Nestled in her sleek leather briefcase was a groundbreaking presentation, a revolutionary medical innovation that promised to transform the treatment of brain injuries in rural and low-resource areas. It was a passion project, years in the making, and one she hoped would inspire global action. Juanita had never sought the spotlight. She preferred the quiet dignity of her work to public recognition, carrying herself with a modesty that belied her achievements. And it was precisely this modesty that often led others to underestimate her, a mistake she had learned to navigate with grace. But grace could not always shield her from the biases of those who judged too quickly. Carl Becker was one such person. A long-time train attendant, Carl prided himself on maintaining what he called order in first class. With his crisp uniform and perpetually furrowed brow, he moved through the luxury carriages like an enforcer rather than a host. To him, first-class passengers fit a particular mould: well-dressed, well-connected, and unquestionably deserving of their elevated status. Anyone who deviated from this unspoken standard was, in Carl's eyes, an anomaly to be scrutinised. And Juanita, with her quiet demeanour and understated elegance, did not fit the image he expected. Carl had spent years projecting his authority over passengers he perceived as out of place. He relished in subtle jabs, veiled under the guise of professionalism, and rarely hesitated to let his biases dictate his behaviour. To him, Juanita's presence in first class was an affront, a challenge to the order he believed he was there to uphold. From the moment she had stepped onto the train, Carl's gaze had lingered a fraction too long, his sharp eyes taking in her tailored coat and natural hair with barely concealed skepticism. As he approached her seat for the first time, his tone carried the weight of judgment, a tone Juanita knew all too well. "Excuse me, ma'am, this section is first class. May I see your ticket?" he had said, the words laced with a presumption she had no right to be there. Though Juanita had complied calmly, Carl's reaction had been as predictable as it was disheartening. A muttered insult, a dismissive toss of her ticket. Small, cutting gestures designed to undermine her dignity. It was nothing new to her, but that didn't make it any less exhausting. Carl's disdain didn't end there. As the train glided further into the Alps, his scrutiny only deepened. He watched her from a distance, finding excuses to linger nearby, his expression a constant mix of suspicion and disapproval. And Juanita, accustomed to the quiet hostility of moments like these, braced herself, because when prejudice is given power, it rarely stays quiet for long. The train hummed steadily through the frosted peaks of the Alps, a picture of tranquility that sharply contrasted the rising tension in the first-class carriage. Carl Becker had not let up. He returned to Juanita's seat for the second time with the same air of condescension as before. His voice carried just enough volume to catch the attention of nearby passengers. "Ma'am, I hope you understand that this is first class," he began, emphasizing the words as if explaining a foreign concept. "Not everyone is entitled to a seat here. Sometimes mistakes happen." Juanita met his gaze with calm resolve, her expression unreadable. Without a word, she reached into her coat pocket and presented her ticket once again. Carl snatched it from her hand, holding it up for a moment longer than necessary, as if examining it for flaws. He clicked his tongue, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Interesting," he said, handing it back with exaggerated reluctance. "You must be very fortunate to travel like this." Juanita's voice remained steady, even as she felt the judgment hanging thick in the air. Fortunate, perhaps. Hard-working, definitely. Carl's expression soured, but he said nothing more as he walked away. Yet his actions spoke louder than words. When the stewardess rolled her cart through the aisle offering drinks, Carl purposefully skipped Juanita's row. He lingered at the neighbouring seats instead, speaking loudly enough for her to hear. "First-class passengers should expect a certain standard," he declared, his words dripping with insinuation. "It's important to maintain the integrity of the space." Several passengers glanced uneasily in Juanita's direction. She remained poised, her back straight, her focus fixed on the snowy vista outside her window. But inside, she felt the familiar sting of injustice, the quiet anger of being singled out without cause. The tension only grew when Juanita attempted to retrieve her luggage. Rising from her seat, she approached the overhead compartment. The bag, a sleek professional case, was situated just above her. Before she could reach it, Carl appeared at her side. "Ma'am, that bag isn't yours," he said sharply. His tone wasn't questioning, it was accusing. Juanita turned to him, her brow furrowed. "Excuse me?" "That's a luxury bag," Carl continued, gesturing toward it as if presenting evidence in a trial. "Another passenger reported it missing earlier. I'll need to verify." For a moment, silence hung heavy between them. Then, slowly, Juanita extended her hand toward the bag and unzipped it. Inside, perfectly folded, were her personal belongings, a neatly organized laptop, medical journals, and a presentation folder bearing her name. "Would you like further proof?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Carl's jaw tightened. Without apologizing, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Juanita standing in the aisle under the watchful gaze of the other passengers. Moments later, a young train attendant approached her cautiously. He was a wiry man with dark hair and nervous eyes, glancing over his shoulder as he spoke. "Dr. Sinclair, I just wanted to say—" He hesitated, his voice low. "I'm sorry about him. Carl can be difficult." Juanita gave him a small nod. "Thank you for saying so, but difficult isn't the word I'd use." The attendant flushed and looked away. "I understand, but confronting him could get messy. He's been here a long time." Juanita studied him, sensing the fear in his voice. "Thank you for your concern," she said gently, "but silence enables people like him to keep behaving this way." The attendant nodded quickly but offered no further help, retreating to the safety of the service car. Carl's next move came swiftly, and it was unmistakably public. As the train curved around a bend, he stopped mid-aisle, loud enough for every passenger in first class to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's come to my attention that some passengers may not belong in this section. Please ensure you have your tickets ready for inspection." Juanita's composure remained intact, but her patience was wearing thin. She could feel the weight of every gaze on her. This wasn't about a ticket, it wasn't even about a bag. It was about something far more insidious, a prejudice that Carl was no longer bothering to hide. The hum of the train softened as it slowed for an approaching station, but inside, the tension had reached a breaking point. The quiet hostility had turned into open humiliation, and Juanita knew it was time to confront it, directly and unflinchingly. The train slid into a quiet station surrounded by snow-draped evergreens. The stop was brief, just enough time for passengers to stretch their legs or exchange seats. But this stop would be anything but ordinary. Carl Becker stood rigidly in the aisle, his voice sharp as he pointed toward Juanita. "Ma'am," he began, drawing the attention of everyone in the first-class carriage, "I need you to step off the train. We'll be conducting a further investigation into your behaviour." Juanita sat motionless, her gaze fixed on him. The subtle hum of the train faded as the words settled over the compartment like a thundercloud. A murmur rippled among the passengers. Some exchanged bewildered glances, while others whispered in hushed tones. Juanita rose slowly, her movements measured. "And what exactly am I being accused of?" she asked, her voice calm but cutting through the air like a blade. Carl crossed his arms. "Disturbing the peace. Several complaints have been made about your conduct." A scoff broke the tension, coming from a passenger a few rows back. All eyes turned to a sharply dressed woman with a sleek black bob and commanding presence, Emilia Rinaldi, a prominent business executive whose name often graced financial news headlines. "Complaints?" Emilia repeated, her tone dripping with incredulity. "By whom? Because I've been here the entire time, and the only disturbance I've seen has been from you." Carl's confident posture faltered, but he didn't back down. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this isn't your concern." "Oh, it most certainly is," Emilia replied, standing to her full height. "And I'll tell you why." She turned toward the other passengers, her voice rising to command their attention. "Do you realize who you're accusing?" she asked, pointing toward Juanita. "This is Dr. Juanita Sinclair, one of the most renowned neurosurgeons in the world, a humanitarian who saved countless lives and is on her way to present a groundbreaking medical innovation." Gasps rippled through the compartment. A man seated nearby dropped his phone in shock, while another leaned forward, wide-eyed. "Dr. Sinclair?" someone whispered, the name rolling through the space like a revelation. Juanita remained silent, her steady gaze fixed on Carl as passengers began to murmur louder. Carl opened his mouth to respond, but his words died in his throat. His face flushed red and his composure crumbled under the weight of the stares bearing down on him. Another passenger, a middle-aged man with a grey beard, pulled out his phone and aimed it toward Carl. "This is unbelievable," he muttered, hitting the record button. Emilia wasn't finished. She stepped closer to Carl, her expression fierce. "You've publicly harassed and humiliated a woman of extraordinary accomplishment without a shred of evidence to back your accusations. Do you have any idea how absurd you look right now?" The train staff had begun to gather near the door, their faces a mix of confusion and unease. One of them, a younger attendant, hesitantly stepped forward. "Mr. Becker, perhaps we should." "Quiet," Carl snapped, though his voice wavered. Emilia gestured toward the passengers filming the exchange. "Oh no, let him speak. Let him explain why he singled out Dr. Sinclair while the rest of us enjoyed this ride in peace." Carl's confidence drained entirely as the weight of the moment sank in. Juanita, still composed, stepped forward. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice steady yet commanding. "It's about the assumptions you made before I even opened my mouth. And now the entire world will see the consequences of those assumptions." The passengers nodded in agreement, their expressions a mix of support and indignation. The train conductor appeared in the doorway, his face stern. "What's going on here?" he demanded, taking in the tense scene. Emilia spoke first. "You'll want to review the footage," she said, gesturing toward the passengers holding their phones. "Your employee has a lot to answer for." Carl's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. He glanced toward the conductor, hoping for an ally, but found none. "Mr. Becker," the conductor said, his voice cold, "we'll discuss this in private. For now, step away from Dr. Sinclair and return to the staff cabin." Carl hesitated, but finally relented, his shoulders slumping as he retreated. The passengers erupted into quiet applause, some nodding in Juanita's direction with newfound respect. As the train began to pull away from the station, the first-class cabin buzzed with conversation. Emilia turned to Juanita, extending a hand. "Dr. Sinclair, I'm sorry you had to endure that," she said sincerely. "But I hope you know you've just made a lot of new allies." Juanita shook her hand, offering a faint smile. "Thank you," she replied. "But this isn't about allies. It's about accountability." And as the train pushed onward through the snowy peaks, Juanita's quiet dignity and strength left an indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed the unfolding drama. The tension in the first-class cabin lingered like an uninvited guest, even as Carl slunk away to the staff cabin. Passengers murmured amongst themselves, some still clutching their phones, their screens glowing with recorded evidence of the incident. Minutes later, the train manager, a middle-aged man with a meticulously pressed uniform and a clipboard tucked under his arm, arrived. His face was a mixture of apprehension and regret as he approached Juanita. "Dr. Sinclair," he began, his voice measured but laced with urgency, "I've just been informed of what happened here. On behalf of the entire train service, I deeply apologize for the unacceptable behavior you've endured." Juanita met his gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. She said nothing, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. The manager's hands fidgeted with the clipboard. "I assure you, Dr. Sinclair, this matter will not go unaddressed. Mr. Becker will face immediate disciplinary action, and we will investigate this thoroughly." Before Juanita could respond, the train slowed, pulling into a quaint station nestled in the snowy expanse. The manager glanced toward Carl, who had reappeared, now standing stiffly by the door. "Carl Becker," the manager said firmly, "you are relieved of duty effective immediately. Gather your belongings and disembark at this station." Carl's face went pale, his defiance replaced by disbelief. "Sir, This is not up for debate," the manager cut in. His voice was steel, leaving no room for argument. "Your actions today have not only violated our company's policies, but have also brought disgrace to our reputation. We'll contact you regarding further proceedings." The first-class passengers watched in silence as Carl, his face flushed with humiliation, picked up his satchel and stepped off the train. Snow swirled around him as he stood on the platform, watching helplessly as the train began to pull away. Inside the carriage, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations sparked between passengers, their voices mingling with disbelief and indignation. "That man should never have been allowed to interact with passengers," one woman muttered to her companion. "And to treat her of all people like that," another added, shaking their head. Juanita, however, remained composed, her gaze fixed out the window as the snowy landscape blurred into motion. As the train journey continued, the incident spread beyond the confines of the first-class cabin. Passengers who had recorded the event began uploading their footage to social media. The clips captured the entirety of the altercation, from Carl's accusations to Amelia's dramatic reveal of Juanita's identity. Within hours, hashtags like "Justice for Juanita" and "Riding While Black" began trending worldwide. News outlets picked up the story, juxtaposing footage of Carl's actions with Juanita's poise. The outcry was immediate and fierce. Critics called out the systemic biases exposed by the incident, while others lauded Juanita's grace under pressure. Influential figures from around the globe voiced their support for Juanita, many highlighting the broader implications of the event. Meanwhile, the luxury train service faced an avalanche of backlash. Prominent activists and public figures demanded accountability and systemic changes. The company issued a formal apology, acknowledging the severity of the incident and pledging to implement diversity and sensitivity training for all employees. For Carl, the fallout was swift and unforgiving. News outlets unearthed complaints from previous passengers about his unprofessional conduct. His name became synonymous with prejudice, and his attempts to defend himself were met with widespread skepticism. Juanita, on the other hand, became a symbol of resilience and dignity. Her calm demeanor during the ordeal inspired countless individuals, many of whom shared their own stories of discrimination in high-end spaces. In an interview following the incident, Juanita addressed the public with her characteristic grace. "This is not just about me," she said, her voice steady but impassioned. "It's about challenging the assumptions and biases that so many of us face every day. No one should have to justify their presence on a train, in a workplace, or anywhere else, simply because of who they are." Her words resonated, igniting a global conversation about equity and inclusion in luxury industries. And as the snow-capped mountains faded into the distance, the impact of that single train ride continued to ripple far beyond the tracks. As the train glided into its final destination, the story of what had unfolded in the first-class cabin was already reaching far and wide. Passengers continued to whisper amongst themselves, many offering quiet words of encouragement and respect to Juanita as they disembarked. Juanita stepped off the train with the same grace she had shown throughout the ordeal, her head held high. By the time she reached her destination, the Global Health Summit, her name was trending across social media, not as a renowned neurosurgeon or philanthropist, but as a woman who had turned an act of humiliation into a moment of profound change. Later that evening, Juanita sat in her hotel suite, her phone buzzing incessantly with calls and messages. Friends, colleagues, and strangers alike reached out to express their solidarity. Some shared their own stories of discrimination, while others simply thanked her for her courage. Juanita could have allowed the incident to end there, leaving the public outcry to settle on its own, but she understood the significance of the moment. This wasn't just her story. It was a reflection of a systemic issue that needed addressing. The next day, Juanita made a public statement at the summit. Standing at the podium, she addressed an audience of influential leaders, policymakers, and media representatives. What happened on that train was not an isolated incident, she began, her voice steady and resolute. It was a symptom of a much larger problem, one that persists across industries and borders. Bias, whether implicit or explicit, has no place in our society, and it is our collective responsibility to confront it. Her words resonated deeply, sparking applause and nods of agreement. But Juanita didn't stop at words. She proposed a bold initiative, a partnership between international organisations and the luxury travel industry to implement comprehensive cultural sensitivity and diversity training for service staff. The initiative gained traction quickly. Within weeks, Juanita was working alongside civil rights advocates, global NGOs and travel executives to create a robust training programme aimed at fostering inclusivity and empathy. The impact was profound and far-reaching. Major luxury travel companies announced sweeping reforms, including mandatory sensitivity training for all employees, anonymous feedback systems for passengers, and stricter oversight of staff conduct. Juanita's proposals became the blueprint for these changes, and her involvement lent the initiative both credibility and urgency. Passengers began to see tangible improvements in their travel experiences. Stories of respectful and thoughtful service began to replace tales of bias and discrimination. Carl Becker, on the other hand, struggled to recover from the fallout. While he issued a public apology, the damage to his reputation was irreversible. His story served as a stark cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked prejudice. For Juanita, the incident became a defining chapter in her life, not as a moment of victimhood, but as a catalyst for change. In interviews, she often reflected on the event with grace and humility. This wasn't about one person's actions, she explained during a televised interview. It was about a system that allows such actions to go unchecked. I wasn't the first to experience this, but my hope is that through advocacy and reform, I can be one of the last. Her words inspired millions, from travellers to industry leaders. The luxury travel industry, once seen as an exclusive and often unwelcoming space, began to shift toward greater inclusivity. Juanita's initiative led to similar reforms in other sectors, proving that the ripple effects of a single act of advocacy could reach far and wide. Years later, Juanita's story continued to be shared as a testament to the power of dignity, resilience, and determination. Her face graced the covers of magazines, not just as a world-class neurosurgeon, but as a changemaker who refused to let injustice go unanswered. And though the snowy train ride through the Alps was long behind her, its lessons endured, reminding society that the fight for fairness and equity could happen anywhere, even in the quiet confines of a first-class cabin.